This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Now, this is the part of the story that starts to get really murky, is how did this whole thing get funded? And I guess that the canonical story, the gospel story, you might say, is that Chick approached a renowned, you might say, Boston gambler, Joseph Sports Sullivan. And Sullivan didn't really want to touch it, but maybe he thought he could have got the money, because they're talking about $100,000. That's a lot of money back then. That's millions of dollars in today's money. Eventually, at least how it plays out in the book, 8 Men Out, and in the movie, is that they sort of the players get some money from a former player, Sleepy Bill Burns, and they get some money from Joseph Sports Sullivan, but all of them are bankrolled by a famous gangster / gambler. I think they called him the financier of gamblers, Arnold Rothstein. He's a real connection when we hopefully soon do our organized crime series. He was connected with all of the major Jewish gangsters of the time, and he even got some of the famous Italian gangsters started. He was connected with Meyer Lansky. He was connected with Lucky Luciano. Like all of these people, he was their money man.
Yeah, you mentioned Arnold Rothstein. It's one of those weird. Maybe it's just a me thing, but it seems like Jewish gangsterism is something that just kind of has been forgotten, but it was really big. And I mean, maybe down the road we'll end up doing this movie Once Upon a Time in America, which is about Jewish gangsters around this time period, give or take. And I just thought that was a little tidbit.
Yeah, I think that really, that's what really puts Arnold Rothstein situates him in his place. He's not just some dude who's a gambler who did a gambler done well, like the guy from Casino. I think his name was Rothstein too. He was just a gambler done good and got the attention of the mafia. Arnold Rothstein was organized crime through and through. Yeah. And I think I 100% agree with you that the Jewish gangsters of that time period do not get their due, even though they were crucial in all of the later mafia history that we learn so much about. They were involved in every bit of it. Dutch Schultz, Monk Eastman, like all of these guys were absolutely critical in early 20th century organized crime. And Arnold Rothstein was the guy who bankrolled all of them.
Yep. And he bankrolled the Black Sox scandal. And in my opinion, all the money came from him. But I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about your theory of how this whole thing went down.
It really is confusing. And I think that this was either absolute genius on Arnold Rothstein's part or he screwed it up. And I'm not sure what happened. I think that if, in fact, Arnold Rothstein was the one who bankrolled it, which I'd probably say it's like 99.9%, he couldn't get his name involved in it. And I think that's why he had to use all these intermediaries like Sleepy Bill Burns and Joseph Sports Sullivan and Ava Tell to play it off, because if his name was in any way associated with it, it was going to destroy the betting odds, which that's maybe something that we should discuss, is the whole gambling and how that works.
Yeah, well, in what sense do you want to discuss it?
I think with odds, because odds is something that was the real profit margin. The odds on favorite to win the series was Chicago, without a doubt. And I think it started off that they were 3-1 odds, saying that 3 times out of 100 or whatever, that they were going to win this. And so if you were to put your money on Cincinnati, chances are you would lose. But if you put in $1,000 on Cincinnati to win the series at 3-1 odds, you would get $3,000 back for winning. Yeah. So those odds really made a big difference in how much money you could make as a gambler in winning of who won.
Yeah. And like you pointed out, if Arnold Rothstein had somehow he had gotten connected to this, the odds would go from probably in Cincinnati's favor if he was putting money down on Cincinnati, because everyone would know, oh, the fix, there's something going on here. There's a fix going on. And as you pointed out, that's why he had to use all these like intermediaries. But he seemed to have played them kind of off each other, did he not?
There's any sort of permutation of different ways that this was being done, but it seemed like he had given Sports Sullivan some money to play with, and then he gave Attell money. But some of the stories say that Rothstein he had given some money to Sullivan to pay the players off with, but he told Attell that he was out, and Attell was his main man. We should explain Abe Attell a little bit of who he was.
Oh yeah, Abe Attell, he was a boxer. I believe it was featherweight division. He was a pretty small man, but he was a legit champ, and he started throwing like his own fights to a degree, or making them go couple extra rounds, and he would get payoffs for doing that. And after he retired from boxing, I guess he had made friends with a bunch of people within the criminal underworld, which is, even to this day is not too far away from boxing, and was good friends with Arnold Rothstein and was kind of his right-hand man / muscle.
Yeah, go look at pictures. You can Wikipedia Abe Attell. He's ripped. For back in those days, a lot of times you'd see a fighter and they kind of have a little bit of a gut, or he was absolutely ripped in his face. I think it was that boxer's mug of, taking too many hits. You can look at his face for hours. He doesn't look like anybody you'll ever see in today, I think.
Yeah. And he had a great line too to Arnold Rothstein, where Rothstein's talking about, the kids used to make fun of me because I couldn't play baseball or something along those lines, or sports. And he tells Attell, like, I made twice the amount of money, from betting on your fights that you did actually fighting them. And Attell says, well, I was the champion of the world. And Arnold Rothstein says, you were. And Abe says, no, that's where you're wrong, Rothstein. I'm always going to be champ. And there's truth to it, in the sense, if these Chicago White Sox players had just won this World Series,
they'd be legends.
They'd be legends. Arnold Rothstein, nobody could ever take that away from them. And they pissed it all away for a couple $1,000.
You get, I think, in a lot of ways, you get that's where it's played off. Rothstein is going to make, I think some estimates put that he made over $1 million in wagers back then. $1 million. I don't know what that is, but in today's money, it's a lot of money. But those players would be absolute legends of all time if they had won that, because they would have won the 1920 World Series. Probably without a doubt. I would put money on that. And they probably would have won the 21 series. They would have dominated all throughout the 20s, that team.
Yeah, and then even with Seacott and his arm kind of going, wear and tear. I mean, Red Faber, he only had one bad year in his entire career, and that was 1919 because he had influenza.
Yeah.
He's in the Hall of Fame. So it's not like they didn't have reinforcements coming down the pipe either. They could have probably won 3 or 4 World Series in a row, and they would have made just as much money, and they would have been legends in the community. They'd show up to a restaurant. They're not paying for dinner.
So what do you think about do you think that it really even matters, the conspiracy all with the money, with the Tell and Sport Sullivan and Sleepy Bill Burns and all of these conspirators? It almost doesn't matter. There was somebody bankrolling it. It was probably, and it was almost certainly Arnold Rothstein. And after that point, it really, who cares in a lot of ways?
Yeah, I don't some people find that aspect of the story pretty interesting. I don't find it all that interesting. I mean, Arnold Rothstein, put the money out there and gave it to certain individuals. And the interesting part is why the players thought this was a good idea, because none of it would have happened unless they wanted to go along with it and their motivations behind it. Because to me, that's the core of the story, is the fact that these players betrayed their manager, Kid Gleason, their boss, Kami, even though they might justify that they were doing it for righteous reasons. But in particular, they betrayed the fans. And the fans loved them. They adored them. They cheered them on and felt the same heartbreak that the players felt when they didn't win. And I can speak from personal experience. I was just talking to you yesterday. I was watching Toronto Maple Leafs play, and it's a very stressful game, and I'm going up and down, and and it just hit me that these players pissed away that I would be willing to care that much about them playing a game and being that emotionally invested with them. I'm not gonna sit here and say like, oh, when they lose a game, it hurts the same amount as me as a fan watching it. But I mean, it definitely bothers me when I see players that I care about lose and struggle. And these players just didn't care about any of that. The fans are like, whatever, who cares?
I wonder too, as a fan, what would that do to your psyche? And what do you think just putting yourself into that position in 1919, you've invested all of that. You know that this is the greatest team that stepped onto a baseball field, and then you learn that they threw it, especially when you go through the whole cycle of the game of the series where they come back and that's heart-wrenching.
Yeah, 100%. I think I said this to you before. I've been lifelong Toronto Maple Leaf fan, and if anybody knows anything about hockey, about the Maple Leafs. And there's been a lot of more dark periods than good periods, especially within my lifetime. But I've always stuck by them. And if I found out that the players had done something like this, I said this to you, that would be the only thing that the organization could do or the players could do that would get me to stop watching them. I couldn't handle it, because it would just remind me of, oh, I remember when I stayed up till, God knows when it was triple overtime, and I'm biting my nails every second, the puck goes near the net, and these guys just said, screw it, I don't care. And it's like cheating on a spouse. It's like cheating on a wife, or it's the same thing.
It really is
what these players did to the fans.
What do you think the betrayal of Comiskey? Because I think they show it in the movie a little bit, but Comiskey was really betrayed by this. And I think he felt like a cheated on spouse, that he legitimately poured his heart and soul and every bit of himself into baseball and into this team. How do you think the betrayal impacted Comiskey?
I don't think he was ever really the same again. And I know people will say like, oh, he was just in it for the money and yada, yada, yada. But when the indictments actually came down on these players, I believe the White Sox were a game away from winning the pennant again. And Comiskey just said, nope, that's it. You're all suspended. If he financially speaking, it was in his best interest to win the pennant and then get those World Series, get those playoff money bucks. And he said, I think he was holding out that this would kind of all go away, but I mean, I think he was wishful thinking in terms of that. And to me, him just suspending them right away, all the players that were somewhat involved, shows to me that he truly did care about the integrity of the game.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. Now, before we'll definitely come back and revisit Comiskey and that whole idea of this suspending them. What do you think that they owed each other and the other players on their team, and really the other players in baseball too, and the Cincinnati Reds and all the other players? Do you think that in a way they betrayed them by throwing the World Series?
They definitely betrayed the Cincinnati Reds, because it's not fair to them. If you read a little bit about the history, the Cincinnati Reds went on some people consider a little miracle run, making it all the way to the World Series, because I don't think they made it to the World Series again for quite some time. And I don't think they won it until like the 70s. I want to say was the next time that they won the World Series with I believe the team was the Big Red Machine, and Pete Rose was on that team. And it's kind of ironic that Pete Rose was on the Reds. But they definitely betrayed them, because those guys earned the right to go to the World Series and play against the best team in the American League and compete with them playing 100% and, not fixing the game. They earned that right. And it's always going to be in the back of their head, whether did we truly win that World Series, or, did these guys just fix it? And it's not fair to them. They spent their whole lives playing baseball to reach that moment. And these Black Sox players decided, well, who cares, right? We can make a couple grand. And yeah, it's betraying them. It's betraying all the other ball players too, because it's making a mockery of the league. Something that people devoted their entire lives to and had been injured and trained and sacrificed, time with their families and yada, yada, yada. Like I get that they're being paid, but, to spend weeks away from your kids is not easy, regardless of what you're getting paid.
A big thing that I think really needs to be brought up is the whole culture of gambling. You brought it up in boxing, that boxing had a really big gambling problem back then. Look at Abe Attell, and it really does still to this day. And different sports had big gambling problems. Professional wrestling, when it was still professional, in a lot of ways, gambling helped to destroy professional wrestling as a quote unquote real sport. Did this have the opportunity of killing baseball, of how ingrained gambling was in the game?
100%, in my opinion. I believe if they didn't come down as hard on the players as they did, I mean, gambling would have snuck its way back in there, and then this would have happened again. And, that to me would have been the death of the sport. I mean, gambling in general, I've always found it. I mean, I get it if you're somebody like Sports Sullivan and this is what you do for a living. But to me, gambling on a sport, I don't know. I've never done it. And it always seemed kind of weird to me, because people say, well, it adds more excitement to the game because you have more, more tied up into the outcome of the game. But to me, it just enjoy the game. You're watching the guys who are the best at their craft, going head to head against one another. Is that not enough entertainment? I've never understood. To me, the gambling in sports just leads to nothing but problems. Gambling, like you're playing cards and what have you, to me, and it's weird because it seems to be making like a big comeback. Like I'll watch a hockey game now and there's a banner on TV about gambling, and then the intermission there's gambling, and the guys commenting on the sport are talking about gambling. It's nonstop gambling. And I just had this recently where and it just came to me where they've been constantly talking about gambling, and I was watching a hockey game and there was a line fight, which is basically all the players on the ice at the same time end up fighting, and they cut away from that because they don't want to show the violence on TV. And I'm like, what are you talking, like, what do you think is more damaging to a kid? The fact that you guys are telling kids to be constantly gambling on the game, where a couple of guys get into some fisticuffs. Like it it's one of those weird moments I had, because I guess I was hypersensitive to it because we've been talking about this scandal in general. And I'm like, I just don't want the gambling at all. Like, don't advertise it at all. Like, why is the NHL involved in gambling? It seems you guys are trying to play a legitimate sport. I don't know. It seems the whole thing is bizarre to me.
I don't watch a ton of professional sports, but I was watching the NFL playoffs and following the Bills through it, and then watching the Super Bowl. And it seemed like just about every other ad was for the new sports book and all of the gambling. And I think that I 100% agree with you that it was such a problem back in the 20s and in the early 20th century of gambling being in the stadium, people making bets in the bleachers. It was so ingrained in the sport that I think, I don't remember where I read this, but there would be gamblers who would throw things at the players as they were going to run to first base to try and affect the game. And I don't see how I don't understand why the league would either back then 100 years ago or now wants to have gambling in the stadium. You can't avoid having it in the halls in Las Vegas or in Atlantic City or wherever, but I don't understand why you want to put that in the stadium. It seems like you're just setting yourself up for all of the bad incentives of back then, because the money now is certainly enough money at hand that they could pay a year's salary of any of the top players today.
Yeah. And
the money's huge.
The argument would be, and the argument against that would be like, well, these players, they all make so much money now. But I mean, not necessarily. In hockey, there's something called entry-level contracts where you make league minimum for, I believe it's like 3 years. And some of these players, they come into the league and they're like good. They're the best players on the team, and they're not making chump change. I believe it's like $750K is the yearly salary. But once you take in taxes and everything else, you're probably looking at around 400,000, 500,000 maybe. If a gambler comes to you and go like, hey, if you miss this pass here, you could make a couple $1 million, because that's the type of money that's involved. It's not out of the realm. I don't think throwing like a Stanley Cup or World Series would be possible now, but throwing games, yeah, 100%.
Especially when you look at it, what's really changed between 100 years ago and today. Every single one of those players knows. Seacott knew it, especially Seacott in the 1919. His expiration date was getting very, very, very close. And so for him, that 10 grand was his retirement fund. And I could see that today with any number of players in any sport. You can get zapped and never play a game again, and then you're bagging groceries or whatever. And somebody coming along, Sports Sullivan in 2022 or 2023, coming and saying, here's several $1 million. And like you said, you're not saying throw the World Series, throw the championship game. Just don't catch this pass, or you're a goalie and let a couple of pucks get by you. That does not seem like a big stretch. And I think the big difference was that in 1920, they realized we can't have this in the stadium. We can't have it we can't have this gambling industry completely connected to what we're doing. And I would actually love to hear what people out there have to say about this, because this is really one of the most controversial issues, I think, today is gambling, sports gambling. And I would love to hear what the listeners have to say. Are we completely out of our minds? Are we all wet on this? Or are we making some sense that you don't want to have the gambling in the stadium?
To me, it's just self-evident. You don't want it in the stadium. You don't want the league promoting it. You don't like all the reasons that we've pointed out. It's going to lead to all types of problems. And I see it coming down the road. I think one particular sport that we could maybe see some problems is the UFC. Now, if you don't know all the ins and outs, UFC fighters make significantly less money than the top boxers. Like the top UFC fighter makes a fraction of what the top boxer makes. And like we pointed, like at least the perception of the players, the Black Sox players thought they were making less money than their peers. This is what they thought. In the UFC, it's very stark compared to boxing, like where Tyson Fury, who's the heavyweight champ right now, is making like $100 million a fight or $50 million a fight. The UFC, top UFC fighter right now, Francis, I can't remember his last name. He's the heavyweight champ. He's making a fraction of that. And you see it where like these UFC fighters are doing boxing matches now just because the paydays there are more. It would not surprise me in the least bit if a UFC champion decided, I can make, $50 million off this fight. It'd just be easy if I just, maybe let it go in a couple extra rounds. Or maybe I lose by decision, then I can get my rematch. I honestly would not be surprised if that happening at all, because the UFC is right in it too, promoting with the gambling, which is so bizarre to me because it's been such a problem in the fight sports for the longest time, because it doesn't involve like a team. It's just literally one guy.
That was in a lot of ways the biggest problem with throwing the entire series, is that they had it just looked so bad. I think the movie did a really great job of portraying how bad it looked for them throwing it, but you can listen to the game, because back then, if you were in New York, you would just be listening to telegraph messages from the game. And you can even pick it out from that they were really bungling the game. That Lefty Williams game where it was the 15 pitches and he was yanked. He was bungling it so bad. Or like you said, when Seacott cut off that ball that would have been an instant out, Happy Felsch, he blew a couple of big plays that were just clearly blown it. I think Risberg had more errors in a game than he had all year. It was so clearly they were throwing it. But when you put it back, that if all it really requires, it was really a matter of scale of throwing the whole series. If they had just had to blow a game or two, they could have made that look totally legitimate. And in fighting, in a boxing match, you can take a fall. That was Abe Attell in this story. That's what he made his whole career on, was take it. He was an Academy Award winning actor on taking falls in boxing matches. And I don't think people would be the wiser of any of that until it all blows up. And that's what blows up a sport.
Yeah. And it seems in particular, these Black Sox players weren't very good actors. It's hard because you trained your whole life to play good at a sport, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, no, I got to screw up on purpose. And they do kind of mention it in the movie where Seacott's like pitching and he's actually trying to pitch badly, so the batters are getting hits, but none of the other players are really, like, it still hasn't clicked into them yet. It's like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to drop this ball, and they're catching the ball and stuff like that. And Seacott's like, oh man, I'm just gonna have to do this myself. And there's a lot of truth to it, where like a professional boxer will get into like acting or something like that, and he has to like retrain himself because he's trained his whole life to actually hit somebody in the face really hard. And if he's on a movie set, like, no, you got to like totally like relearn how to do this because you're doing it for fake, right? I just thought that was a nice little tidbit of information. It's hard to be bad at something that you're really good at.
The rest of the whole story is at the end of the 1920s season, it all really falls apart. And it really wasn't even anything that they had done. There was a huge scandal with the Chicago Cubs that put a lot of light onto the whole problem of gambling. There was a whole thing with Hal Chase that completely blew up, and his involvement with Chick Gandil in particular, and that it all kind of just came together. And there were so many irregularities with the trial. But in the end, what happens with the trial?
Yeah, so the trial, they're proven innocent of all charges. It was kind of a fiasco from my understanding. Like, people from the streets were like coming in and viewing the trial, and it just seemed the whole thing comes across as very unprofessional. And the baseball owners come to the conclusion too, though, is that they need an unbiased commissioner who's not associated with the National League or the American League and has a lifetime appointment. And they decide it's this Judge Landis, who, from my understanding, was famous for hunting commies, which was a big issue in the United States at the time. And I guess that this would be the wave of the initial Red Scare.
Yeah, and the anarchists and all that.
Yeah, and so he gets a lifetime appointment as the new baseball commissioner, and he's basically been given 100% control of getting the gamblers out of the professional baseball. And his first, order of business is he doesn't care what the jury says. It's very obvious that these guys had worked with gamblers to fix this World Series, and he bans all 8 players for life. And he words it, I don't have the exact wording of what he says, but he says even people that are aware that there's a fix going on, even if you're not participating in it, you're banned too. And this is where it hits home to Buck Weaver.
I think of all the players, Chick, Seacott, Happy Felsch, Lefty Williams, Fred McMullen. There's one other one. It doesn't really matter. I think those players who took money and were involved in every step of the way of the fix, they had to go. And I think even to this day, they shouldn't be allowed back into baseball. I think that a big conversation could be had, though, about Buck Weaver, who didn't take any money, but who was more intimate in his knowledge of what was going on. And then on the opposite side, Shoeless Joe, who took money but had no clue what was going on. I think that's a whole different discussion on how they should have been treated, not only right after the events, but now that they've been long dead, 50, 60, 70 years now.
Yeah, I mean, you were discussing what would have been the proper course of action with Buck Weaver in his particular case. I would say I agree with what Landis did in terms of dropping the hammer as hard as he could, because he had to make it perfectly clear to everyone in baseball, owners, managers, players, anybody, that even just talking to gamblers is going to get you kicked out of the sport for life. But I mean, a more fair assessment would have been suspending Buck Weaver maybe for 2 years, 3 years. So making it clear that, 2 years, 3 years in terms of a baseball career is a big deal, right? You only have like a prime, most players are in and out in a couple of years, right? Most players don't have like a super long career in any professional sport. But it would get the point across perfectly clear that, yeah, just even talking to gamblers, it's going to cost you a lot of money. To me, that would have been more fair.
And probably in a lot of ways, he could have sent the same message, because I think it's a totally different thing between the players who were involved and took money. They had to go, and they had to be out. Whereas I think with Buck Weaver, that's more of a guideline or a rule that you set after the fact. I don't think you can apply that backwards, especially since how prolific all of these conspiracies were to gamble and to throw games. You can't say after the fact, well, you had some it's some meeting with gamblers, so now you're out forever. I just don't think that was fair to Buck. And I think that for Buck, even if it ruined, if they had to say, you know what, Buck, you're completely out of baseball, I don't think that that should have precluded him from being put in the Hall of Fame, or maybe coming back as a manager or a something, a coach or something like that. I think that they could have done something for him. I think I have to agree with you that probably the best thing they could have done for him is 3-year suspension. That sucks big time. That's especially when the pays started to really increase. He was probably going to lose $20,000-$30,000 in 1920s money in salary, and then might only have 2 more years left. But I think he could have rehabilitated himself. He had an opportunity, and I think baseball had an opportunity to rehabilitate him. And I think in a lot of ways they blew it.
Yeah. And I guess like the further away you got from the event, I guess if you're running baseball, you're involved in, upper management in baseball, you just don't even want to talk about it, really. You just want to kind of just forget about it. And reinstating Buck, I guess, would be, I guess they just didn't really care. That's what I think, is they just wanted to be done with it all.
Now, what do you think now, 100 years later, or at some point after Buck was dead, after all the principals were dead, do you think that reinstating him somehow now, I mean, any of these things, when they talk about giving some war hero a medal after the fact that they had been kind of screwed out of, it's can come across as a hollow gesture. Do you think that Buck should get reinstated into baseball now?
Me personally, yes, I would reinstate him, because it's very clear with all the new evidence coming forward that, Buck kind of got screwed. I guess the way baseball might look at it is, if you reinstate Buck Weaver, people are going to start talking about Pete Rose, right? And like, to me, Pete Rose should not be in the Hall of Fame. That's my personal opinion. But people, I guess the argument will be like, well, you reinstated Buck and he did this and this and this, and now you got to let Pete Rose join the Hall of Fame. No, to me, that's how baseball might look at it. I could be wrong, but to me, that would probably be their perspective, is we can't do it because it's going to lead to this, this, and this.
The Pete Rose issue hanging over everything since the 80s or the 90s or whatever, that probably is the thing that casts the shadow over Buck Weaver and maybe Shoeless Joe. We'll get into Shoeless Joe in a minute. I think in a way, maybe Pete Rose, since we're bringing him up, can you separate somebody like Pete Rose from the really horrible things he did to the game to the amazing things from the game? Can you separate those, that maybe when he's dead, he's pretty old now, I think he's in his 80s, but he still is alive as of the recording today. Can you separate those, and maybe when he's dead, he can't personally enjoy those accolades, but they can kind of rehabilitate the good things he's done for the game?
I don't know. To me, it's tough. I mean, there's no denying it. He's one of the greatest baseball players of all time, one of the greatest hitters of all time. But I don't know. It's hard to me personally, it's hard to separate the two.
It almost makes me want to go into a theological direction with this, but we'll step away from that. We're not going to go that deep into it.
Yeah.
But I think that I'm really torn about that, because I think that brings us, Pete Rose is really the natural thing to start talking about. Shoeless Joe. Shoeless Joe took money, but didn't really know what was going on. Does Shoeless Joe have a case? Well, let's say in 1920, after he's been found not guilty, he's been acquitted of conspiracy. They know he had something to do with it, and they know he took some money. Should he have been given a chance to get back into baseball?
I mean, he took money, right? It's the whole thing with Shoeless Joe is just very perplexing, because I know what was going on with him. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he didn't talk to any gamblers. He wasn't involved in any of the meetings. Lefty Williams told him some things and showed up later, and he took some money for not playing badly in baseball. Like it's really bizarre. Like I don't know what to make of it.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. I'm completely in the same boat. I would have liked to have seen Joe come back just because I think we would be talking about Shoeless Joe Jackson with an asterisk next to his name. But I think he would have wound up being better than Babe Ruth in the live ball era.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that make that argument that Shoeless Joe was apparently Babe Ruth watched Shoeless Joe hit, and that's how he got his hitting better. He would watch. He said, I think he said Shoeless Joe is the best natural ball hitter he'd ever seen, and he used to watch Shoeless Joe hit and try to work that into his batting swing. I mean, that's the other thing. That's the mystique of Shoeless Joe Jackson is what could have been. You know, he really could have been one of, if not the greatest ball players of all time, and we'll never know. You know, he got kicked out of the league and because of this scandal that he maybe was part of, was not part of. We don't really know. I tend to believe that he really had nothing to do with it. And it's just really bizarre that he took the money, but then continued to just, you know, set a record that stood for 50 years in the World Series. That's the mystique again about Shoeless Joe is, you know, he could have been the greatest ball player of all time, but everyone knows him because he was part of this scandal and it was, you know, cut short.
By my estimation, I think he's another one that they should have given a 2 or 3 year suspension to and let him play, because I don't think he would have ever have thrown a game again. He really could have been a lesson to the other players, like, don't do this.
Yeah. Because we're like, if we're willing to suspend Shoeless Joe for X amount of seasons for maybe somewhat tangentially being involved in this type of scandal like this, you know, what are we going to do to you if you're actually involved? I mean, they showed that as if you're actually involved, we'll just kick you out for life, right?
Yeah.
I guess it's Landis decided that he was going to use a sledgehammer to smash a watermelon, or I don't know, as the saying goes, you know, like I'm just going to overkill it to make my point as clear as possible. But yeah, I'm thinking about Joe right now, and the whole thing is just truly bizarre. I don't know what to make of it. I don't think he should have been suspended for life though, because he clearly did not try to lose any of the games at all. I don't think anyone can point to a moment where Joe flubbed a play or didn't hit a ball or anything. From everything I've read, he played on the level for the entire series.
To me, I think for my money, Joe should be totally put into the Hall of Fame now. I think they could do it. They don't have to go and say it in a regular induction with great players of the past that, okay, now we're going to sneak in, slide Shoeless Joe Jackson and Buck Weaver into here. I think that they could do it where it's maybe give them an honorable mention. Look at these guys. What they did was really wrong. We don't condone it 102 years later, 105 years later, but there's a reason that we can put an asterisk next to their names. There was something that did not smell right here. There was something rotten, but they deserve to have their names rehabilitated. I think that's really the least that baseball could do.
Yeah, I would argue even with Buck Weaver, does it even really need an asterisk? Because he didn't take any money at all, and he played on the level the whole time. And even, you know, like I pointed out earlier, Roy Schock said he wasn't part of any of this. Shoeless Joe, the asterisk might go there because he did take money, and I guess there's some ambiguity about, you know, what he didn't do in the series, but I don't know, everything that I've read, and I've read a fair amount, is, I don't know, he played on the level and just kind of went along with this because his friend Lefty said it was the right thing to do.
The hammer 100% for the 6 of the players but these, I think that would be in a lot of ways a good way to end the whole thing and kind of put that into the past of baseball, is to give them some honor back, give Shoeless Joe and Buck Weaver some of their honor back, and that they really did make a real contribution to the game, and that they made a major mistake. They clearly paid for it in their lifetimes, in their natural lives. Do they really have to pay for it for their afterlife and for the rest of history? I don't think so.
No, I mean, even at the time that it happened, I mean, you were saying like maybe a couple of years suspension would have done the deal with these two guys in particular. To me, I don't know what Buck Weaver's career was like exactly. I don't know if he's Hall of Fame material. I know in baseball it's really hard to get into the Hall of Fame. Hockey, it's not as difficult, but I know baseball has like super high standards about who gets into the Hall of Fame and doesn't get into the Hall of Fame. But it would be nice for even Major League Baseball to just make a statement saying, we've reinstated Buck Weaver into Major League Baseball.
It probably is really hard to say if Buck would have been a Hall of Famer, but I think he would have had himself a completely solid career, and probably not one of the greatest of all times, not Shoeless Joe, not Babe Ruth of his contemporaries, but I think he was every bit as good and as Shock was, and Shock made it into the Hall of Fame. Probably, maybe Chick Gandil, probably we would have never heard of him again, I don't think. No, or he'd be a side note. Oh yeah, that great Chicago team of the 20s. Chick Gandil was a great first baseman. Maybe somebody like Happy Felsch would have made a name for himself in the live ball era. Who knows, really?
Who knows, yeah. Felch probably would have done pretty good, though. From my understanding, he had a decent bat, and with the new ball and the new rules for pitching, he probably would have hit quite a few dingers. Chick, at the time he was above average first baseman. I mean, he wasn't Hall of Fame material. Maybe Happy Felch wasn't Hall of Fame material. Buck Weaver, if he had a full career, he would be pretty close. And Shoeless Joe would have been, sorry for the pun, but yeah, he would have been a shoo-in.
He would have been one of the greatest players of all time. I mean, you would have there's no doubt in my mind, even with the career he had, you can put Shoeless Joe with Babe Ruth. You can put Hank Aaron, A-Rod. You can put he can stand up to any of them.
And another thing, too, that seems to get forgotten when Joe was playing and Babe Ruth and some of these older guys, the parks themselves were also much bigger. So it was more difficult to hit in general. And for a big part of Shoeless Joe's career, and we pointed it out before, is, the pitchers were doing stuff like putting tar on the ball and you couldn't see the ball, half the time. And Shoeless Joe's hitting like 400%, which is, unheard of.
So we've really, I think both of us, we've really thrown ourselves headlong into this, especially for people who aren't particularly baseball fans. I mean, speaking for myself, I enjoy going to a baseball game, but I'm not a baseball fanatic. But I think that if you really love history and you love all of these ideas, this is the perfect thing for people like us, even if we're not baseball fanatics. And I think a good way to maybe wrap all of this up is, what was something that you learned that really stuck with you? And maybe I'll start and I'll let you have the last word for it. For me, I want to say what really stuck with me on this was just the complexity of all of the gambling and this web of gangsters and gamblers and all this big money that was all interwoven into the American pastime, the American game, and all of this just really sliminess that was all under the current, and the fact that baseball was able to get out of it and have a great 20s and a great 30s. And really, it did something to it. Baseball did something to itself that professional wrestling wasn't able to do. In a lot of ways, even boxing and a lot of sports that faded away, and all these other, even minor league baseball leagues that just couldn't get past all of this, and that Major League Baseball did. And I think that speaks a lot to as harsh as kind of Judge Landis was, and Ban Johnson and all of these guys. I think that they really did recreate the sport out of this really terrible time. What do you think? What to you really grabbed you from this?
Like you pointed out, just how like ingrained the gambling was in baseball. Like I did a little dive into the history of baseball for leading up to this podcast, and there were like gambler riots on the field where like gamblers would actually storm the field and would riot if a game didn't go a certain way. Like that's how ingrained it was. Like you talking about like people betting in the stadium, right? And as you pointed out, just how like Judge Landis was able to clean this up in a couple of years. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. And I think baseball kind of by accident saved itself to a degree by, changing how the ball was wound up and taking away certain pitches, because it let people like Babe Ruth shine and start putting up crazy numbers. I don't think people realize, like, when Babe Ruth hit like 50 home runs, like the highest before that was like his previous record, which were like 25 home runs. Like he was putting up unheard of numbers and became a national icon. And it helped people forget about this dark time in baseball history with the Black Sox. And I don't know if it almost seems like they kind of stumbled into that by accident, because they'd already decided that they were going to kind of make it a more hitter friendly game. And it just kind of worked out perfectly.
And if you can't get enough of this baseball history, tune in to the next time, because I'm going to talk with somebody who is pushing the effort to get Buck Weaver reinstated into baseball. And so you're going to even get a little bit more 1919 Chicago Black Sox. So thank you, Chris, for coming on today. I had a great time, and you'll definitely hear more from us soon.